Welcome to Future Histories. My name is Jan Groß and my guest today is Daniel E. Saros, with whom I will be talking about digital socialism and the abolition of capital. Before we get to the interview, I'd like to say a few words on this. What you are about to hear is an in-depth discussion of Daniel Saros's proposal of a socialist political economy with its own socialist laws of motion and a socialist mode of production. More than anything, this is an invitation to everybody out there longing for fundamentally different political economies to please join the discussion. And if I say everybody, I do mean everybody, and specifically people coming from other traditions of thought and political orientation. I'm really honestly interested in your opinion on that. This whole thing here is meant to be an open and honest investigation of how fundamentally different kinds of futures can be brought about. And I do believe that Dan's work is an important contribution to this, since he dares to do what many shy away from. He puts out a concrete proposal. Such a proposal can only be seen as a starting point, of course, and I can't stress this enough. This is a wholehearted invitation to engage with these ideas. I put an extra effort in creating the show notes for this episode, so you'll find a lot of resources for further engagement with the topic there. We will cover the proposal as well as its historical foundations in great detail, so much so that I had to split the 3-hour interview into 2 episodes. The second part will be released in episode 32 of Future Histories in 2 weeks' time. Patreon supporters, however, can listen to it already starting today. So if you are super fixed by what you hear today and can't stand waiting another 2 weeks, every support on Patreon is greatly appreciated. But now, please enjoy today's episode with Daniel Saros on digital socialism and the abolition of capital. Welcome to Future Histories. My name is Jan Groß and my guest today is Daniel E. Saros. Daniel is a professor of economics at Valparaiso University and author of the book Information Technology and Socialist Construction, The End of Capital and the Transition to Socialism, which we will discuss at length in today's episode. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Great to have you. First of all, thank you, Daniel, not only for taking the time for this interview, but also for writing this book. I think it's really of vital importance that we develop very concrete proposals for alternative political economies, yet many shy away from exactly that and end up in vague appeals to solidarity that might be more immune to criticism, but at the same time, they do not provide answers to the crucial question of how exactly an alternative to the capitalist mode of production should be organized. So I was delighted to read your very concrete proposal, which addresses basic questions of political economy and its mode of production head on. What is it that you aimed for with your book?
Well, ever since I was a graduate student at the University of Notre Dame, I've been studying Marxian economics. And around 2008, it became clear to me that I could not continue working in this tradition unless I answered the question for myself, just how the socialist mode of production would operate. So it's really not enough to criticize capitalism. One must have something concrete to offer in its place. And so I began working on that question. And it became clear to me that a socialist society would need to find an alternative movement that could replace the movement of capital, as Marx described it in Volume 1 of Capital. So it would need to have its own logic, its own dynamic that would be self-sustaining and allow for the continued development of society's productive forces. So most importantly, it would need to eliminate the exploitation of labor power, which is the defining feature of the capitalist mode of production. So I think we need an entirely new method of economic organization. We don't want to simply focus on interventions within the capitalist system, such as minimum wage laws and Keynesian macroeconomic management, as much as those kinds of interventions might be important in a capitalist society. to achieve equity, economic stabilization. What we need is a full-blown alternative that can really stand on its own. And even though it will emerge from capitalist society, it's going to be something entirely different.
And in order to build a sketch of how this could look like, your book has 4 parts. First, the logic of capital. Second, the defense of capital. Third, the renewed challenge to capital. And fourth, the end of capital. These are all very much relevant for the investigations of this podcast. So please, let's take a look at each of them. In part 1, you first describe the capitalist laws of motion. You then argue that while Marx did indeed provide an analysis of the capitalist mode of production, he did not provide a concrete answer or idea of what socialism would actually look like and how it would be organized in practical terms. First things first, what is the logic of capital and what does it mean to abolish capital as such?
Well, I think to understand the logic of capital, you really need to read volume 1 of Marx's Capital. There's no substitute for it. It's very difficult to read the first time, especially part 1 on commodities and money, but it's worth the effort. And so capital obeys certain rules or laws of motion, and that is what I mean when I refer to its logic. So Marx describes how commodity exchange within capitalist economies may be represented symbolically as CMC prime. So that is, commodities are sold for money and then they're used to purchase other commodities. This is the sphere of circulation where Adam Smith's invisible hand operates. People pursue their own self-interest and they exchange their property for the property of another person, and then that leaves both sides to the exchange better off than previously. At the same time, Marx identified another movement that can be easily overlooked. And this movement is capital and is symbolically represented as MCM prime. So in that case, money is used to buy commodities, and then the commodities are sold for a larger sum of money. And the difference is surplus value, the difference between the amount of money initially spent and the amount that's realized at the end. That difference is surplus value. So it's realization and appropriation are what motivates capitalists to set capital in motion. So how is this surplus value possible? Well, Marx argued that there is a special commodity that's available in the marketplace in capitalist societies. And this is the commodity labor power, which is the capacity to work during a specific period of time. So it's sold as a commodity in the marketplace. And it has this special property that when it's consumed, it actually creates new value, since human labor is the source of value. So the really amazing feature of this commodity labor power is that its value depends on the values of the commodities that the worker needs to live and work, but its value creating power is actually larger. So during the course of a working day, a worker will create new value equivalent to what they need to live and work. But then because they work during the entire working day, they create value in excess of that. And that surplus value is what motivates capitalists to pursue capitalist production. So the basic movement that I just described has been this driving force throughout the history of global capitalism. And this accumulation of capital has really revolutionized the means of production and created this world that we have today. So to come back to your question, what does it mean to abolish capital? It means to bring an end to this economic category as Marx defined it. And so we want to identify an alternative movement that can positively develop society's productive forces and better serve human needs. So it is possible, of course, to abolish capital and you could destroy human civilization, but that's obviously not what most of us want. And so what we want is a positive substitute for this thing that Marx called capital.
You write that it is important for us to, and I quote here, recognize the crucial point that even if everyone on the planet adopted Marxism, socialism would not be possible unless certain objective conditions were met. What these conditions are is the key question that must be answered. And on this question, Marx and Engels had precious little to say. According to your book, there is a silence both about these objective conditions for socialism as well as on the question of how a socialist political economy would be organized in practical terms. You call this the Great Silence. Could you maybe explain this a bit to us?
Sure. I argue in the book that there are really two essential conditions that must be met for socialism to be possible. So the first is what I'm referring to as the acquisition of social consciousness throughout the human population. So this means that we need to become conscious of the fact that we are members of the human species and that we work together to achieve some sort of balance between our productive activities and the natural environment. And furthermore, we must recognize that capitalism involves a conflict between social classes and that we'll never achieve this balance as long as this conflict continues. So one condition then is that we become conscious of these things. The problem, however, is that even if we all become committed Marxists and acquired this species consciousness, it would still not be sufficient to alter the mode of production, I argue, because certain objective conditions must also be met. So specifically, our productive forces must be sufficient to produce an abundance of use values for consumption. That is a condition that socialists, I think, have long recognized, that we be able to produce a huge abundance of use values, of material wealth. Without this ability, we would enter into conflict with one another over what is available. We would also not produce enough beyond what's needed to satisfy our basic needs to then further develop the social forces of production. So in other words, there wouldn't be anything left for investment. So more is needed then. And what we also need is to be able to communicate our needs to each other in a way that is conscious and planned, and then use that information to efficiently allocate resources to produce what we need. So socialists have long argued that the ability to produce an abundance of use values is a key requirement for socialism to be established. But again, this emphasis on the communication of social needs has been given less attention, I think. So I argue that Marx and Engels did not specify these conditions clearly, and they argued instead that speculation about the socialist future was a utopian exercise. They had really very little to say about the subject of socialism, especially in comparison with how much they wrote about capitalism. And I think this silence on the question, it appears as a contradiction in Marx's worldview. And this is something I bring up in the introduction to the book. That is, the proletariat is supposed to consciously establish socialism, and yet we cannot describe what socialism is in any detail. And there seems to be a conflict there. And so really the whole book, I would say, is about trying to resolve this apparent contradiction. How could Marx hold both views simultaneously, that we're supposed to consciously bring about socialism, but at the same time, we should not describe how it is to function in any detail? That seems contradictory. So really, to resolve this contradiction, I think what we need to do is recognize that Marx's vision was limited due to the insufficient development of society's productive forces or its technological capability. In other words, modern information technology was not available or even conceivable in Marx's time. And so I argue that this modern information technology is one of the essential objective conditions that must be in place for the socialist mode of production to be possible. So whereas it was once utopian to describe how socialism would function, it's really no longer utopian because we possess the means now to make it a reality. So I think Marx was really honest in that he didn't offer a false solution, but only identified the features of what he called the lower and higher phases of communism that could be only imperfectly described at that moment in history. So this seems to me to be the only way to really resolve this apparent contradiction in Marx's thought, unless we just accept the view that there is no alternative to capitalism and that Marx was simply wrong in what he wrote.
And isn't it a classical retreat to say, oh, well, no, he didn't specify it in that much detail, because this would have been a kind of, I don't know, paternalistic act where you have this blueprint of the future, and that instead it should kind of organically evolve out of the movement itself, and that anything else would be some kind of authoritarian act somehow.
I think that's a good point. And one could maybe argue that that's another way to resolve the paradox, that Marx didn't want to establish the blueprint and, as you put it, in a paternalistic manner, tell the working class what it should be doing. You certainly could take that position, but that, it seems to me that that leaves the questions just so open-ended, and with so much disagreement about what to do, it's hard to imagine the working class ever. And maybe that's part of the problem, is that there needs to be unity among the workers as they pursue this. If there's such widespread disagreement within the working class, how could they ever transform the mode of production completely? So I think that may be a potential problem with that way of resolving the paradox, although one certainly could try to do it that way.
And I totally agree with you, actually, that because I also believe that it is necessary to have this imaginary of a different kind of future. And also, I think the point is quite valid, that this imaginary future should not be utopian in essence, in the sense that the basis for its realization is actually not existent. So I like your point, or your twist, that you're saying, all right, we need this image, and we do have the means of production now to make it possible. That's kind of the punchline that I got from your book, and I really enjoyed it, actually.
Thank you.
Okay, so now let's get to the juicy stuff. Let's get to the socialist calculation debate. You have a long chapter on this topic, and I very much enjoyed this chapter as well. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, there has been quite an argument about the question of whether or not an autonomous socialist mode of economic calculation is possible or not. This has been labeled the socialist calculation debate. What were, from your perspective, the key arguments within the debate? Who were the participants, and what can we learn from it?
Well, this debate took place primarily between market socialists like Oskar Lange and H.D. Dickinson, and Austrian economists such as Ludwig von Mises and F.A. Hayek. I give much credit to Mises in the book for arguing that socialists lack a method of economic calculation. In his view, without competitive markets, it would not be possible to have a rational economic system. That is, without market prices, we are left fumbling around in the dark without a rational guide for our decision-making processes. And this point was very important, and I believe it is what Hayek referred to as the unseen problem facing socialist alternatives. This fumbling in the dark, of course, opens the door to the use of coercion or a command system, which many socialists rejected at the time, and even more reject the use of command now. So Mises thought it was logically impossible to solve the problem any other way than through voluntary exchange. And Hayek found it to be logically possible to solve the problem, but that the information processing requirements were so massive that it could not be solved in a practical sense. And it was also not possible to even acquire as much information as would be needed in his view. Now, market socialists, on the other hand, wanted to have some form of socially owned property while relying on the competitive market to allocate resources. So some economists argued that the problem of market socialism could be resolved in a variety of ways. One of the early papers by Enrico Barone described a trial and error method of solving the problem. So we could adjust prices. A central authority could adjust prices in the face of surpluses and shortages. And in that way, commodity markets could be cleared. The same method could be used to clear the money capital market. Hayek rejected this solution on the grounds that competition could lead to more rapid price adjustments than a central planner could achieve. H.D. Dickinson argued that an elite planning body could estimate supply and demand equations and then solve a system of simultaneous equations to determine the optimal market clearing prices. So I want to make a couple points here. That's kind of an overview of the debate as I understand it. But first, I want to say that I interpret the socialist calculation debate as stemming from the same problem that Marx and Engels encountered, and thus why they did not say more about the socialist future. So that is, Marx and Engels hesitated to describe the future socialist society because they lacked the means to do so. And only modern information technology allows for this socialist calculation problem to be solved. So the debate, I argue, stemmed from the combination of Marx's superior theory of capitalism, but his inability due to historical constraints to describe how the problem would be solved. So it's understandable then that there would have been such a lengthy debate in the early 20th century about how to resolve this problem. And second, if socialists have adopted Marx's theory of capital, why are they striving to achieve the ideals of perfect competition as neoclassical economists define them? If neoclassical economists possess a flawed theory of how capitalism functions, by, for example, omitting class exploitation, then why would you strive to achieve their efficiency results? Schumpeter, for example, was very critical of market socialists for choosing this path. And I agree that this is kind of an odd way to try to solve the problem. Why would you build on a theory you disagree with in an effort to resolve a problem with your own theory? I'd actually make a really bold claim, and that listeners might not agree with. But I would argue that both sides in that debate were interested in it because both actually wanted to know if a solution exists. Market socialists favored Marx's theory, and they were eager to put forward a solution. Austrian economists, I would argue, also they recognized the problem and they were interested in whether there was a solution, but they were skeptical that a solution would be found. And so even though I think Austrian economists recognized the strength of Marx's theory, but they didn't want to publicly acknowledge it, which would certainly be a controversial claim for some. I include some references to Hayek's statements in my book, where it suggests that he, at some point, tried to kind of pull back from some of those views because he didn't feel there was a resolution to these problems. So I think mainly that's what I think we can learn from it.
And just out of curiosity, I really liked it that at some point in your book, you point towards the need to look at the base of the argument. And as you already explained right now, you think that Marx did a proper analysis of the capitalist mode of production, but did not provide an alternative to the question of economic calculation. And then Hayek, on the other side, cleverly uses this omission as the base layer of his argument, while at the same time not providing a proper alternative analysis of the capitalist mode of production. But this still leaves open the question if there has been an attempt to fill Hayek's omission and develop an Austrian analysis of the capitalist mode of production. I don't know if anybody did this, maybe Rothbard or anything, because if you say that they saw what Marx did right and they had a valid point in the question of economic calculation, then they must have had the urge to make it complete, to come up with their own idea of how to interpret the capitalist mode of production, no?
Yes. And I think the roots of Austrian economics go back to late 19th century, the work of Karl Menger, and they do possess a theory of capitalism. But I would argue it's inferior to Marx's theory because, like neoclassical economics, it avoids class conflict. And so it really has less to work with in its analysis of capitalism. And that's really at the root of its inferior nature relative to Marx's theory. However, it has much to say about monopolistic firms and their behavior, capital theory, the theory of the business cycle. My textbook, actually, which is available online for free, includes quite a bit of this material. It's available at principlesofpoliticaleconomy.pressbooks.com for anyone who's interested in looking at it. So Roger Garrison, actually an Austrian economist, gave me permission to summarize in my textbook his diagrammatic representation of Austrian macroeconomic theory. And I also include Rothbard's discussion of an Austrian measurement of the money supply. So even though I ultimately favor Marxist theory, I do respect theories that have been developed within other schools of thought, including the Austrian school.
That's nice, because I think it had some when I was reading your book, I had the sense of intellectual honesty somehow, So it's I think it's important to engage in the arguments of the different fashions. I don't want to say the other side, because that would be too dualistic. But I very much enjoyed that you obviously take this serious, the argument of the Austrians. And there would be a second question relating to that, and that is actually going into the other direction, not in the direction of how to complete the theory by providing a autonomous interpretation of the capitalist mode of production. But if Hayek, because I was then looking at Wikipedia, when did he die? And he died in 1992. So he must have experienced the advent of computer technology. And if it was, as you said, that he at some point kind of opened this loophole that there might be a way to provide a different type of economic calculation, but that it is just not discovered yet, then he actually must have considered computers and information technology at some point. Did he write about it, or are there some public statements about this?
Yeah, you've asked an interesting question here, and I have to confess, the truth is I don't know for sure. I'm really not an expert on all of Hayek's work. My interest was in the factors that influenced the debate in the 1920s and the 1930s. And I do regard it as an error to think that computers solving systems of demand and supply equations could bring about socialism. The kind of solution that I propose really relies on information technology, but in a very different way. And I don't think that this use of computer technology could have been imagined in the early 1990s, much less in the 1930s. So my suspicion is that Hayek would have thought that the problem of acquiring so much information and processing it would still remain, even with the kind of computer technology we have in the 21st century. And I guess here's coming back to my punchline, I think that the kind of system that I have proposed is not one that any of the contributors to this debate had in mind at all. It's completely different from what they were talking about, or even how they were imagining how computers might be used in the future. So I think that's probably what sets my proposal apart. And but as far as whether Hayek actually commented on that question, I really don't know.
When it comes to popular positions that defend capitalism, you picked an, for me, curious candidate, Ayn Rand. You picked her as your sparring partner. This came somewhat of a surprise to me, because I knew about her influence on the early Silicon Valley elite, and I have seen a documentary by Adam Curtis where her philosophy is explained, as well as her influence on, for example, Alan Greenspan, the former head of the Federal Reserve. Yet I always thought of her more as a pop cultural phenomenon, or even a sectarian, actually, to be honest, than a serious thinker. Could you introduce our listeners to her philosophy and maybe explain a bit why you picked her in order to make your point?
That is a great question. The truth is that Rand actually challenged me the most of any of the pro-market writers that I've encountered. I was not very familiar with Rand's work when I started this project, and I discovered that she defended capitalism in a way that sharply deviated from the free market economists that I had been reading for years. Rand's theory is a moral theory of capitalism, and to use morality as a starting point for thinking about capitalism was completely new to me. Rand thought of herself as someone who celebrates what humans are, and in her view, they are creative and capable of extraordinary feats. And because of the nature of human beings, they possess rights, in her view. Specifically, the individual possesses a right to life and to property, and only if these rights are protected will an individual be able to realize who he or she is and unleash his or her creative potential. So when governments interfere with these rights, these rights derive from nature, and so governments then act immorally when they interfere with them. Since capitalism protects these rights, it's a moral system in her view. So this whole way of thinking was really new to me, and I knew that I would need to settle for myself what, if anything, was wrong with her worldview. Also, my book is ultimately about what humanity should do at this point in history. And Marx and Rand both speak directly to that extremely broad question in a way that is openly political. And so I wanted to take on a position that did not try to conceal its normative biases while posing as objective and neutral. And this fight sort of seemed like an open and honest fight between thinkers. So that's mainly why I chose to devote so much attention to her view in my book.
We've touched upon the subject of market socialism before, but since it is still a very popular position within the socialist movement, I'd like to hear your general take on why many still favor market socialism today. And I'm also interested in a specific question related to that, because in your book, you write about the historical socialist calculation debate, and I quote here, "In fact, in my opinion, the Austrians forced the debate and they received a neoclassical answer," end quote. And you already talked about this. What I'm asking myself then is, does this hold true for today's market socialists as well? Do they provide a neoclassical answer as well? Or did they come up with a different rationale?
Market socialism seems to possess the best of both worlds. And I think that's a major part of the reason why so many still favor market socialism. It offers freedom of choice of consumer goods and of occupation. It promotes efficiency through competition. At the same time, it eliminates private ownership of the means of production. And so it's aimed at eliminating the capitalist exploitation of labor power. So in addition, it can also involve Keynesian demand management to lessen business cycles. It can offer corrective taxes and subsidies to address externalities in markets. It will ensure sufficient attention to the production of public goods. So it's a mix of characteristics that is supposed to retain what we like about capitalism while eliminating the rest of it, the things we don't like, or that many of us don't like. It appears to many socialists to be the only answer that really avoids command central planning on the one hand, or capitalism on the other hand. And so it's like a third way between the two extremes. So I think that's the main reason why it's been so popular. But in terms of whether market socialists have their views evolved or changed, I think the rationale for it is still pretty much the same since the socialist calculation debate, except that maybe less emphasis is placed now on the neoclassical efficiency results. Now I think emphasis is placed more on issues like equality and solidarity and democracy as outcomes that are also achieved in addition to efficiency. But to the best of my knowledge, I don't think the basic position has changed all that much.
And what are, from your position, the shortcomings of market socialism? What are the strongest arguments against it then?
I think market socialism, it might be able to achieve self-management within enterprises, although there's no guarantee of that. It has a chance of achieving that, as well as direct appropriation of profit by the workers within an enterprise. I think that's probably its greatest strength, but the problem is that it does not eliminate profit as an economic category, and which is a shortcoming. So it really does not abolish capital as an economic category. So therefore, competition between enterprises will continue along with the macroeconomic instability. that is experienced within capitalist societies. Needs will continue to go unmet in the system because profit's really the basic objective of enterprises still, and not the fulfillment of needs. And finally, as the Hungarian economist Janos Kornya explained, it's likely to slip towards either market capitalism or towards command central planning. Failure to replace capital with an alternative sort of self-sustaining dynamic is going to cause its strength to grow to the point where market capitalism is revived, or coercion will be needed to stop its resurgence.
All right, and that's why you had to come up with a different solution, actually. So let's get to the end of Capital. First of all, let's talk about the socialist laws of motion that you propose. I think what has become clear by now is that you argue for the abolition of capital as such, and that if we abolish the capitalist mode of production, we of course need to propose a different mode of production with different laws of motion. In your case, these would be socialist laws of motion in a first socialist mode of production and later on a communist mode of production. Let's do this step by step. First of all, what does it mean to have socialist laws of motion in place? What are their characteristics and their logic?
By socialist laws of motion, I mean a self-sustaining mechanism that allows individuals within a complex organic economy to pursue the fulfillment of needs, while it also guarantees them compensation for their useful labor. So if I were to summarize it in one sentence, that's how I would put it. There's obviously a lot more to it, but it will provide people with a set of rules and specific forms of interaction that will allow them to cooperatively work towards needs fulfillment without the social relationships becoming exploitative. So this mechanism has to be elaborated and understood before it is introduced. We can't really discover its inner workings after it is brought into existence, the way that we must do with capitalism. The reason, again, is that the socialist mode of production must be a conscious creation if it's to ever exist. It's not going to emerge on its own without anyone's conscious direction. It's something we have to create. So we need to understand what this social mechanism is before we actually live in such a society. That's what I argue.
And what is it that you propose? What are the general properties that a socialist mode of production should have?
I argue that the socialist mode of production must place the self-conscious individual human being at the center. So the individual recognizes the importance of communicating his or her needs to others and of responding to the needs of others when making decisions about production. It's a society without the capitalist exploitation of labor power. Labor power does not exist as a commodity. And since markets give rise to labor power as a commodity, markets do not exist. So the wealth of society does not consist of commodities, as Marx described capitalist society in Volume 1 of Capital, because commodities are unities of use value and exchange value. They're both useful things, but they also have a value in the marketplace. And since there are no markets, then things are not going to be exchange values. They won't be considered commodities. So every product and service consumed then would only be a use value. And so the trick is in trying to explain how society can use modern forces of production, including our very extensive division of labor, to produce use values that do not become commodities. So again, I need to make that more concrete, which I hope to do later in this interview, but that's essentially it.
Yeah, great. I hope so too, that we will get to the concrete propositions, and we will for sure. At some point in your book, you quote a neoclassical economics textbook by Samuelson and Nordhaus, which says that, and I quote here, every society must have a way of determining what commodities are produced, how these goods are made, and for whom they are produced. And that, end quote. And that these are the, quote, three fundamental questions of economic organization. So here we have our concreteness, actually. I think that's fair enough as a basic practical standard, or at least I think it absolutely makes sense to expect these questions to be answered in a socialist economy as well. So let's use these three fundamental questions in order to go through your proposal. The first one would be, how do you determine what is being produced?
I'm really glad you asked this question, because these are the questions that show up in every neoclassical economics textbook, Samuelson and Nordhaus and every other one. All students of economics, are introduced to economics in this way. How can we organize the economy to address these questions? And what are the different ways of organizing an economy to address these questions? So it's going to be difficult for me to explain the mechanism completely without the use of tables, but I'll do my best. I refer listeners to a paper on my selected works page that has the details. It goes into a lot of depth about how this would work. But within the socialist mode of production, workers' councils would post use values in a general catalog or a universal catalog of use values. And then consumers would select these use values and place them in something called a needs profile, to which they have electronic access. These use values would be arranged in order from most desired to least desired and given rankings in descending order as you move down the profile. You can leave empty spaces in the profile that will help one to kind of rank some needs much more than others. Every person's need is ranked the same as every other person's need. And this information is used to determine how much of each type of use value a workers' council will produce. And so this really answers the question of what to produce. Information is collected from consumers as they register needs in their needs profiles. It'll determine what's produced and the quantities produced. Then how to produce is really the next question. And the point rankings that are assigned to the use values in the needs profiles are going to be communicated to the workers' councils that posted the use values. So each workers' council will develop its own target mix of inputs that it needs for production, and the points would be used to cooperatively allocate inputs from workers' councils that supply inputs. The points then can be used to allocate inputs according to where the need is greatest. So this method of allocating scarce inputs provides the answer, I think, to the Austrian critique that socialists lack a method of economic calculation. Once the inputs are received, it's also necessary to adjust membership in the workers' council to acquire the amount of labor power needed. I have a mechanism for doing this that involves adjustments in the length of the working period, given income that's based on experience and effort. So at least this gives you kind of a general overview of how I answer the question of how to produce these use values. And then a special workers' council will also be established that sets resource consumption limits in each region, which ensures environmental sustainability. I refer to this as a council of scientists. It has a very special role in the system because natural resources are available in such huge quantities that when this process of allocating resources reaches the natural resource base, we need to have some limits on that, some global limits on how much we're using so that we can meet our environmental goals, which are becoming more pressing all the time. So finally then, for whom are the use values produced? Well, workers are paid with credits for their work. And when consumers purchase use values for which they registered a need, they also receive a bonus in my proposal, which becomes part of their income. And that's also in the form of credits. So the use values are primarily going to be produced with those people in mind who registered a need. Others can purchase the use values using credits, even if they did not register a need, but that action would negatively affect their bonus. So again, I go into a lot of detail in my online paper and in the book about how all this works, but those are the concrete details of the system.
Okay, so I guess I will have to play the role of a advocatus diaboli a bit, because if you put out a proposal like this, some questions will come up. For example, relating to the Council of Scientists that you mentioned, I guess there are two concerns there. One would be the question of elitism, because they have a powerful role within your proposal. They decide upon the ultimate amount of resources that can be used for the economy in total, which is, of course, great because it is a way to deal with questions of ecological collapse. So this is a plus, actually. But still, it's a very powerful position, and people do have different ideas towards this question. So I think this will be a kind of a battleground, of course. And I think the second question that relates to the first one as well is that maybe it's because of the name, it kind of suggests as if there was such a thing as one objective truth or even one science. But that's, of course, not the case. There are many different sciences. There are different approaches towards the same field of a specific science. It doesn't mean that there are just many, many different fields for science, but that there are different approaches towards what science actually is, and that there is no such thing as one objective truth. So I guess my question would be, is there, how do you deal with this? Is there maybe a bit more I don't know, more grayish approach and less black and whitish approach to this question of a council of scientists?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I guess I want to emphasize that this council of scientists has a very limited role to play. It's really only to identify the quantities of these resources in each region that can be sustainably extracted and employed in production. The role pretty much ends there. And certainly, I have not specified, how the decisions within the council would be made. One can certainly imagine trying to establish rules based on consensus decision making or majority rule. I haven't come to any firm conclusions about that on my own. Certainly these scientists would need to defend their positions. I mean, they would need to produce reports defending their claim that we cannot exceed these resource consumption limits. And if we do, this is the likely impact. So there would be checks, there would be scrutiny, and there wouldn't be much incentive for these scientists to misrepresent their views. There may be disagreement about how far we can go, but I'm not quite sure how else the alternative is to allow capital accumulation to continue, allow private owners of the means of production to make these decisions, which I think is a far worse outcome for the planet than if we have scientists who are thinking about environmental sustainability, making these decisions. And we can also have regional councils so that it isn't all being decided at the global level. That might be another way to kind of create less centralized power within that council.
Mm-hmm. Or maybe like competing councils. Like if you have three councils that each have maybe also different approaches, scientific approaches towards looking at the question, and then later on is democratically decided upon which path we want to choose there. I think at many points within your book, I was thinking, okay, you have this general body that is described with great detail, and then there are some peripheries that somebody else will have to look into a bit more and then work out in greater detail, because it's actually not possible to have it all, and maybe not a good way to approach it if everything is written down in the greatest detail, every aspect. It's not possible, I think.
Right.
I think we still have to do some work in order to create this image within our listeners' minds, to get an idea of how this society and how my individual life would look like. Because, I mean, we talked about this general catalog. I can register my needs. I will have to go to work. That's an important point, I think, that you made. I will have to go to work. But how much I will have to work will depend upon how tedious, how popular the work is that I'm doing. So if the work is really very popular, then I will have to work a bit longer than the person who is doing the shitty work that nobody wants to do. We already talked about that everybody will be organized in workers' council. That is actually the name for the socialist enterprise. I think in the book you also mention like subcommittees for different works within the Workers' Council, employment subcommittees and stuff like that. I think one important point that we will have to mention is the legal right of guardianship, you call it. That would be an interesting point that you maybe can explain a bit more. And I think another one would be the question of price formation, because that was a very important point, actually. I think who decides upon how much a given use value actually costs. So maybe let's start with the legal right of guardianship within the Workers' Council. What is that legal right of guardianship?
Well, within the Marxian tradition, a mode of production also gives or has an associated superstructure, which includes all of the cultural and legal and religious and political aspects of society. So I felt the need to, in defining the socialist mode of production, to explain, at least to this, some of the elements of the superstructure that would go with it. And so one of these is the legal relationship between the workers and the means of production. In capitalist societies, it's the right of private property that is the dominant form of property. Means of production are privately owned. So I felt the need to specify a type of ownership for the socialist mode of production. And it's based on collective or communal ownership, but that doesn't mean that everyone just simply owns every factory. Instead, it's the workers' councils, the workers who are members of that workers' council who work at a particular workplace are considered guardians. And this is the legal form of ownership in the socialist mode of production as I've defined it. So each member of a workers' council is also a guardian. They are charged with using those means of production in the direction of the fulfillment of social needs and in making sure that those means of production are used properly and for that end.
As I understood it, it's a bit like a cooperative, but without being the owner of the means of production, actually. So you have these responsibilities, you have rights assigned to it, but it's just not it's just not a ownership of means of productions, no?
Yes, that's right. Because the workers, for example, couldn't decide, hey, we want to sell our means of production to a private owner. That's not an option.
But there's still, and I think that's very important for our listeners as well, there is still personal property, no? So apart from the ownership of means of productions, if you buy something from the general catalog, it will still be yours.
Yes, that's correct. And I think for me, that was one of the important discoveries that made me understand what socialism means. Many people, I think, have a fear that even personal possessions wouldn't be privately controlled or owned anymore. And so I think this distinction between private ownership or private property and personal property is very important. When you purchase a use value, it becomes yours. Your relationship to that is a private relationship. You're going to consume that privately, and therefore that kind of property right should be different from the right of private ownership of the means of production, because that ownership of the private ownership of the means of production is really what creates these class conflicts. When someone owns them, then then they're in a position where they can appropriate the surplus labor of other people. And that's what's giving rise to these problems, these huge systemic problems.
Mm-hmm. I think another huge problem is the profit motive as such. And you have a kind of clever move, I think, to eliminate this as well. And that is that you detach the question how much people are being paid within the Workers' Council. You detach this from the question of how much is being produced. So this kind of tries to escape this destructive logic, actually, of for-profit orientation. Maybe could you explain this a bit more? Because I think this is a really crucial point, actually.
Sure. The way I describe it is that workers would be paid according to a formula, basically. There would be a base income when they first enter a profession, and then their income would grow as they remain in that line of work and become more experienced at it. So workers' councils don't have control of that part of work income. But what they do have control of is effort ratings. So within a workers' council, there would be an effort rating subcommittee where workers would evaluate the performance of their coworkers. So within some limits that I think would be global limits, a workers' council could assign a percentage increase, let's say annually, for performing one's work well, or it could be lower. So within some limits. So incomes then are being determined in this way, and that's completely separate from enterprise revenues. There is no sense in which workers' councils, socialist enterprises would be selling use values and receiving revenues, and then some of those revenues are used for expenses and then for profit. Those categories don't exist in this kind of society. People's incomes are entirely being driven by work and by the bonus income from registering their needs. And so it abolishes profit. And it has to, because if this is going to be a society that abolishes capital, you can't have profit as an economic category.
And how is price being determined? I already touched upon it before, but this is a crucial question for many, and I liked the way you approached it. How is it being done?
When workers perform work and they receive income, I say that they receive it in the form of credits, and also the bonus income from registering needs and purchasing the use values for which one registered a need, that's paid in credits too. These credits are used to purchase the use values. And when the use values are being priced, they're being priced entirely to sell the total amount during that purchase period. So the goal is to just clear the market essentially, and also to pursue the steady and complete sale of the use values. So the Workers' Council might raise the prices if the use values are being sold very quickly. If they're not being sold quickly, it can reduce the prices of the use values. If they're not selling, if they look like they won't be all sold by the end of the purchase period, then they could be even reduced to zero. So some use values may be given away freely. It helps to resolve one of the contradictions, I think, that we see in capitalist societies, where you'd have a depression, people in need, and then you'd have goods on shelves that can't be sold. It eliminates that, because now workers' councils would see that and they would have no incentive. They're not making profit from the sale of these use values, so they can just put the prices down to zero, and people who need these use values can acquire them.
And the reason why they didn't overproduce in the first place is that their production was oriented towards the communicated needs from the consumers, no?
Yes, that's right. Actually, I think that's a great point. And that would help to cut down on the problem of overproduction as well. The fact that planning is being done in such a careful way at the individual level.
And I think we didn't say that, because that's an important information for the listener as well. If you register your needs within the general catalog, you shouldn't register like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of needs that you actually do not need. Because if you do so, then you won't be getting the bonuses. Because how much bonus you get is oriented towards the medium of how much needs were registered by everybody, no? Something like that.
Yes. Yes. And actually, in the paper that I have on my selected works page, I include some different parts of this bonus. And one part is a conservation bonus. So a person who actually includes fewer needs in their profile will receive a bonus for that. So, there's flexibility in the system. The way I've set it up, maybe people would decide to do it differently, but I'm at least proposing some ways in which to tackle certain problems. And one is by creating an incentive for people to limit how many needs they register. They're putting less strain on society's resources, and so they deserve a bonus for that. So that's another element.
How is the superstructure being decided upon? Because for me, the question of how to approach these bonus schemes and how people are being disciplined through penalties and such, it's something I intuitively tend to reject, I have to say. I think it's because of the implicit image of humans that is kind of evoked there. I think I get the point that you're making, because you're kind of trying to not be utopian but realistic somehow. It's not a communist society yet, but a socialist one. People will have to go to work, and they will not be 100% altruistic all the time. And of course, one will still have these capitalist logics internalized as well. And of course, there are limits to our resources. So I kind of read the whole thing as saying, come on, people, let's be honest here. We need some kind of rules. We need some kind of mechanism to, organize our behavior towards a behavior that is better for all of us. But still, something within me is struggling with this approach of market design and mechanism design. Somehow I feel that, I think we will get there within the interview, but first, how would this be decided upon in the superstructure? As I said, the schemes of bonuses and stuff like that.
Yes, that is a great question. And I think it would need to be decided through open and democratic debate. There would be, during this transition period, there would be the need for a state, a socialist state or a proletarian state to actually implement all this. So there would be democratically elected representatives who would work out these details. I think the important point is that every single person would be subject to the same incentives. And so whatever ends up being decided, everyone will be affected in the same way. I think that's very important. So the bonus for registering your need and then actually making the purchase, the bonus for leaving items out of your needs profile. If there's a penalty for purchasing use values for which you did not register a need, as long as all of those incentives are the same throughout the population, I think it will avoid becoming the kind of authoritarian solution that we might fear.
Okay, so let's try to tackle the underlying question of freedom and the individual there, because I think even though I kind of stumble over some of these market design elements and incentive logics, I get your point. I think, I hope. But there will be people out there who will be saying, oh, come on, that's the next Stalin coming up and stuff like that. So the question of freedom and the question of the individual is a crucial one, I think, if you want to bring in as many people as possible. So let's try to kind of work out your position on whether or not this is a freer society or not. So which conception of freedom is emphasized within your proposal, and to which conception of the individual does it relate?
The individual is free to communicate one's needs and to know that those needs have an equal impact on the use of global resources. So that's a new kind of freedom, I think, that doesn't currently exist in our society, and one that people will appreciate. They don't recognize that we could even have such a freedom. So I think that's something I want to emphasize. Also, the individual is free to receive compensation for work that contributes to the social product. So labor that is performed in serving human needs, there is a right to compensation for that. And but there are freedoms that are lost. I will acknowledge. I mean, the freedom to acquire income at the expense of other people, that goes away.
That's a sad loss.
Yeah. Right. So some of what is considered liberty in capitalist societies goes away. People will not own businesses. They won't hire workers and then live off the profits. Now, for some, that'll be a major loss, especially small business owners who are also workers in those businesses. They will feel that as a tremendous loss. I think that we have to recognize that there will be some trade-offs if we move to something radically different. And it seems like we're in some ways being forced to pursue these different alternatives. In addition, people will not own shares of stock and collect dividends as distributions of profit that have been produced by workers. That will go away, that kind of stock ownership, because compensation will be based on work as a member of a workers' council. It won't be based on ownership of means of production, which is essentially what stock ownership represents. And finally, the individual will live and work in a manner that forms a harmonious connection to other human beings and to the natural world. That's really what we're kind of striving for with this sort of society, is that kind of harmony that defenders of capitalism say applies to capitalism, a kind of social harmony. But the critics of capitalism have always denied that. And so this is aimed at trying to create that sort of harmonious connection. So there will be freedoms that are gained in the new society, self-management in the workplace. Workers who currently have no power and no say in what happens will have a voice. But there will be freedoms that are lost. And so I think we need to be honest about that as well.
So, I mean, obviously, if you have a general catalog and you have this administrative body that is administering this this general catalog, the question of privacy immediately pops up. There's only credit, so this means everything is registered, no? And would there still be some way to purchase stuff anonymously?
That's a good question. I think anonymous purchases of use values will be possible. All purchases really can be anonymous, but the information will enter the system. So there's a difference there. And are you concerned about the information being communicated to the system or of it being made public?
Well, I don't think that it will be made public, because that would be a definite privacy breach. But I think there's the concern of misuse. That's one side, and then there's a subjective feeling of being surveilled or not. Right now, if I want to purchase something that I for whatever reason, if I'm sick and I don't want my employer to know whatever, this and that, and I can purchase the medicine anonymously and nobody will ever know, or there are other things that people just don't want to communicate via consumption to whatever system, I guess, So there are these both sides to that, at least, I guess,
Yeah. If this became a widespread way of organizing economic activity, if this became the dominant mode of production, then opportunities to make purchases in the way you're describing would diminish greatly. And so that may be something that we would lose. However, I do think that in this system where people's incomes are not derived from profit or ownership of capital, that there would be much less reason for someone to try to use the information or to even care about the information. If you want to make a specific purchase, there isn't someone who's going to want to really aggressively market to you. And so I think the potential for abuse would be greatly diminished as well.
I think I'm not sure about that. I think there will still be a danger there. There are different kinds of misuse as well, but maybe one should consult the cryptography folks there and try to find some technological rerouting, because there are things like, I think it's called zero knowledge proofs and stuff like that. So where it is possible to communicate a certain type of information, but still sealing another type of information that is kind of bound to it. So maybe there are some technological workarounds for providing privacy, but still implementing a system like that. I think that would be it's still a kind of open question to me, the privacy concern, I think. And
I think those are good ideas.
Yeah, let's talk to the crypto folks, I guess.
Yeah.
Another question is that of coercion. So if somebody does not want to work in your proposed scheme of things, they say, "Oh, come on, you socialist guy, I don't support your system. I don't want to work in that kind of society. I had my small business. I loved it, and you took it away. I'm fucking angry." So,
yeah. I'm glad you brought that that scenario up. I'm not suggesting that there would be that kind of coercive intervention where the state would take someone's business. In fact, I want to avoid that kind of coercive intervention as much as possible in this kind of transition. If a person owned their own business and were the only worker in that business, then nothing would change for them. If they employ other workers, then those workers, the one coercive element in this whole thing, if you want to use the word coercion, it would occur in the transition, because at some point, the workers at a workplace would need to establish their right of guardianship. And so they would need to seize the property. They would need to take control of the property. That's where it happens. It could happen in a small business if there were enough workers who wanted to run it themselves. But yeah, it couldn't happen in a business where there was just one person, because they already control those means of production. But also, workers don't need to participate in this revolution either. They can choose to work for privately owned capitalist firms and continue to buy and sell commodities. Their ability to do that is going to decline as more workers participate in the transition to a new mode of production. So it's really just this coercive element only comes in when the workers take possession of the means of production and workers establish this right of guardianship.
Okay, that's interesting. So you're already kind of pointing towards the question of transition. We will get there. But first, I'm very interested in the point that you were raising. How small can a workers' council actually be? Is it okay if it's just two people, but both of them have equal rights within this workers' council? So they have what today would be called a small business, but it's a small cooperative / workers' council. Would that be possible?
Yes, I think it could be. Now, the system can involve some limits on this. So let's suppose that a very small workers' council is formed and posts use values, and then consumers start to include those use values in their needs profiles. Points then would be communicated to that small council, and the council could use the points to get inputs to produce those use values. One could, I think, say that since those workers are receiving income for that work, we might not want the points to fall below a certain level in order for them to qualify as a workers' council to earn that income. So maybe so many points, maybe is a minimum number of points per worker that has to be achieved before you can even have this happen. Otherwise, there'd be abuse, right? I mean, you could have workers who are just really not doing anything or are only receiving a few points and doing very little work and getting a full year's income every year. And we wouldn't want that. So we would have to have, again, probably some global limits on what the minimum number of points would be per workers' council, so that we're ensuring that actually there is useful work being done and towards fulfillment of needs.
And that actually touches on upon another aspect that is kind of interesting. It is possible for workers' councils to post new ideas into the catalog. So I think that's a really important point to make, because it's not about a centralized authority that comes up with, oh, we need 100 of this and 100 of that, but it's the information and also the ability for innovation is placed within the workers' councils. So they can post a new use value in the catalog, and then people can scroll through the catalog, and if they like it, they will eventually put it on their needs profile, and then it will, if it's not just one person, but as you said, some amount is involved, then it will be produced. And I really like that about your proposal. Another question that relates to the overall topic of freedom and individuality that we're talking about right now is the question of unconditional universal basic income, actually, because that is something that does not exist in your proposal, actually, but it is something that is getting quite some traction right now, and many people are in favor of, because it seems to provide a different kind of freedom, and I like that about the idea of unconditional basic income as well, that I get the sense of, okay, I do not have to think about my existential needs anymore. These are covered. And from this, I get a very, energizing prospect of, okay, now I can really put my energy to use wherever I think it might fit the best. But you're kind of proposing something different. You have a base income, but it's not unconditional. You will have to work for that. Why did you decide against the unconditional basic income?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the aim of this new mode of production is to ensure that people receive compensation for their useful work, and not that they receive compensation regardless of what they do. So the idea behind a universal basic income, I think, is an ethical principle that's not really consistent with my understanding of socialism, which many might find surprising. But I think I even think it's inconsistent with Marxism, actually, because I think Marx's description of the lower phase of communism was consistent, even though he didn't put it quite in these terms, with the principle from each according to one's ability to each according to one's work. And so within the socialist phase, keeping the incentives there to continue working and producing is important. And I think when you move to the higher phase of communism, what Marx described as higher phase of communism, described as from each according to one's ability to each according to one's need, then you move closer to something like that, where all you need to do is register your needs in order to have access to the things you need. Although even there, because you have to contribute as you're able, you do need to engage in some kind of productive work. But this can be broadly defined. And I think, care work is one possibility. A person need not go to a traditional workplace away from the home in order to do this. Even though I appreciate the idea behind a universal basic income, I think in trying to stick to those ethical principles that I understand that relate to socialism and communism, it didn't seem to fit. And that's why I don't have that as part of the proposal.
This has been the first of 2 episodes on the topic of digital socialism and the abolition of capital with my guest Daniel E. Saros. I hope you enjoyed it. Please let me know what you think about the topic and write me if you know about interesting thinkers or practitioners for that matter that might bring in important contributions to the discussion. This is an ongoing engagement, so there will be more episodes that explore different aspects of what I'd like to call the Socialist Calculation Debate 2.0. You can write me via future_histories@protonmail.com, and you can be a part of the discussion on Twitter or on the Future Histories subreddit. So long, have a good time. Hear you in 2 weeks.